Welcome back to Switch to Linux. So today I just want to do a little kind of an opinion piece on part of the state of Linux. Now, I'm not a world expert in Linux and not a huge player in it despite having the channel switched to Linux. But if you follow the story here, Switch to Linux is really about why I decided to switch over to Linux from using primarily the Windows operating systems for so long. You know, I've been using Windows since 3.1. I get up, to Windows 3.1 and Windows 95 and 98 and Vista, and we had an ME in my office, but 2000, and then, of course, XP and 7, and as we looked at all of these Windows systems, why is it that after so long in the world of Windows, I decided that I wanted to switch over to the Linux operating system? Well, a lot of it I have already talked about in previous videos is a lot of having to deal with the privacy situation and things like that. Mostly just get control back. Well, since I've been looking at the Linux community, the Linux community itself is one of the reasons why a lot of people have never really wanted to switch over to it. There were a lot of people, and probably still are, in the Linux community that were kind of rude and kind of standoffish and condescending in a way. Now, I really think that in the last couple of years, that's cleaned up a whole lot, and there's a whole lot more helpful people in the Linux community than there are more, shall I use the word, abusive people. So there's a lot of community improvement. And I think it's fair to say that there's a lot new Linux users. So I don't have good, accurate numbers, and it's really hard to figure out what the good, accurate numbers are. But with more and more people getting frustrated with what Windows is doing, getting frustrated with what Mac has been doing, and then an increase in awareness that Linux is more than command lines and things like that, has caused more people to start looking into using Linux. And so there's a big rush of new users in the Linux community. And it is to that end that I thought I had a very interesting comment on my channel here the other day. And this is what Craig writes. He says, "We are calling themed installs new distros now. And as if we don't have enough Linux distros as it is." And I thought that this was a very interesting comment. Of course, this was left on my Babun Linux review, which is, it's branded as a Linux distro in a way, which is really, it's just a themed up Ubuntu install from English Bob. And it's an overall, it's a good it's a good distro, or like it's a neat play on Ubuntu. Now, we got into a little exchange, and I wrote in there, I said, well, taking the liberal definition of a distro as a combination of desktop, environment, software, etc., then yes, it would qualify. I am not sure that it is anything new, though, but more and more are popping up all the time. And then he writes back and says, how is someone new to Linux supposed to wade through the ridiculous number of Ubuntu-themed distros is anyone's guess. Call it themed install and not a distro. And I write, I might be inclined to agree. Perhaps we need a new classification for some terminology. It is great that new people are getting excited about Linux, and it is good for the community to have an increased user base because more software will become available. But of course, more malware, perhaps, though, we need some type of discussion. And I said, you are giving me something to think about. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about here is, do we as a Linux community need to start having a discussion about different types of softwares, different things that would qualify as distros, etc. And it is a fascinating question to be sure. because I was looking around at various things on DistroWatch and leaving a couple of notes, and I started to think about this. What really is a distro? So a distro, we have to consider the package manager. You know, how is it that applications are added and removed from your operating system? Then we have to consider the software sources. What sources are used to populate your applications? Are you just using a basic Ubuntu source, or are you doing something customized? Of course, what is the base operating system? And then this comment brought up the question of themes, and I was brought to memory things like Farron OS, which is essentially like Linux Mint with a pile of themes inside of it, and there might be a few other differences in there. I thought of Peppermint, which is also just an XFCE desktop on top of, and I can't remember if it's either Ubuntu or Peppermint. So you had a lot of these. There's, of course, Fedora and, is it Kororo, I believe, which is basically just a Fedora install with a lot of extra things. You have Antergos, which is essentially like an installer for Arch. So this is an interesting question. And so with all that being said, I wanted to propose a few things that we might think about in the Linux community. For example, what are we calling distros? And can we have some different terminology? I don't know, maybe like, this is fun tidbit of information. I use raw milk around the house, and I was talking to the farmer, and it turns out that legally in the United States, cows have 3 names. They have the name that the farm gives them. They have the name of the farm is in their name, and the name of their breed is in their name. And so every cow has 3 names, kind of like we have a first, a middle, and a last name for the most part. Some people don't have the middles or whatever, but I'm wondering if we need to start raising this question about, do we need to start talking about these instead of calling everything that comes down the pipeline a new distro? Might we need to start saying things like a themed blah, or, because under that definition, we might really condense down the amount of installs. And I got to thinking about this. So, of course, there's the funny Hannah Montana and Justin Bieber Linux, which I cannot say that I've ever actually looked at. But let's see if they're actually in here. Let's see. I can't remember if these are officially on DistroWatch or not. Oh, good. That one's not. Good, and this one might be. Okay. So we have the Ubuntu Christian Edition, which last I knew was completely unmaintained. I don't believe that they've maintained this at all for a long time. It looks like 2012 is the last comment on this on DistroWatch. And, the Christian edition, I pulled this up because I looked at the Christian edition and the Satanic edition, Well, the Christian edition, this is basically Ubuntu with a bunch of wallpapers put in and a few Bible apps installed by default that are readily available in the Ubuntu Software Center. And so it's not a whole lot more than just Ubuntu with some Bible software added to it. Now, I looked at the Satanic Edition, which is not in here last I knew. In fact, there was even a whole discussion on the Satanic Edition's website where they're talking about, DistroWatch is prejudice against them because they're Satanists. And the reality is, though, is that the Satanic edition of Ubuntu here is really nothing more than some themes. And I could not actually get the whole download for the whole distro there, but what you can do is you can go in and basically all this is just some themes and some wallpapers that you can download. So this really is themed Ubuntu. it's not Ubuntu, or it's not some distro itself. There's no added software. There's no change in it. There's no change in the sources. There's none of that. All it is a few extra wallpapers and a red and black theme put onto Unity 7. And so this does raise a good question. So when someone like English Bob comes down and has the Babun Linux distro that he does, is this really a distro or is it a themed install? Now, in his case, there's no change in the sources, but there's a lot of alterations to the programs that are readily available. For example, on Ubuntu, which Babuntu is based on, Firefox is the web browser that is installed. On Babuntu, I know he uses Chrome as the major one. I do not recall if Firefox has been uninstalled or if it is still there or not. I just can't remember. Of course, there's a lot of other software packages that are available inside of the Ubuntu Software Manager that are installed. And I believe that there's one or two packages that the PPAs have been added so that he could add those. But is that a different distro? Well, not really. It's just Ubuntu with an extra theme. Is that bad? No, not at all. It's great, especially if you trust what he does. He's has a big channel on YouTube, and a lot of people look at what he does. This is his way of saying, hey, this is the entire exact operating system that I use for the community. And so you don't have to download Ubuntu and then do all this other stuff to make it the same distro that he's showing everybody on a day-to-day basis. And that is a good thing. But the commenter leaves a fabulous question. Do we need to call it a themed Ubuntu, or is distro the right word? Because more and more and more and more distros are showing up constantly, and it does raise that question. So then I thought about some other things. I did a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was a week ago or so, I did a review, or kind of like showing people how to use, if I can spell, Clonezilla. So what I did is I downloaded Clonezilla, I put it onto an ISO image, and then I showed you how you use Clonezilla to clone a hard drive. Does this qualify as a distro? Well, it's on DistroWatch. And I would wager no. I would actually like to propose that this would be what you might call a Linux utility. This isn't something that you're going to throw Clonezilla on your computer and use it. It is simply a utility. And there's other utilities. There's boot repair utilities and bootloader utilities and utilities for all sorts of fun things inside of Linux. So maybe we need to, as the community starts growing larger, so it doesn't become more fragmented than it does. I mean, whole Linux community could start looking like X11. Ooh, just put stuff all over the place. And that might be some of what's happening. So what really differentiates a distro versus a themed operating system versus a utility? And this raises some interesting questions, and maybe it's the time that we start thinking about these things. For example, OpenSUSE and Gecko is another one. Gecko is essentially OpenSUSE with a few adjustments here and there. How different is it? Well, not much. Let's see. I think Elementary would be a very good example as something that we call it of its own distro, because it is changing the sources. It's changing the themes. They're developing their own desktop environment. That is what you'd qualify as a full-blown distro. So you have Ubuntu, of course, where a lot of things are based on. And then you have Mint. Well, is Mint a different distro than Ubuntu? And I think that it is, because it utilizes a lot of the core of Ubuntu, but it has a lot of its own package managing, and it's the pioneer of the Cinnamon desktop. So it has its own desktop environment, its own package sources, and its own and its own base. And so when you start talking about that type of stuff, maybe we need to clarify what we mean when we're talking about distro, so that as new users come into the Linux community, we can speak not, and I don't want to say speak with one voice, because at that point in time you start looking at, I've watched too much Tom Naughton, particularly his video Diet, Health, and the Wisdom of Crowds. Go check that video out. You don't want to speak with one voice, but we want to have a little bit better understanding of the definitions we're using. And so I'm just looking over here on DistroWatch, and I'm looking at some things. Do we need to say that all of the flavors of Ubuntu are all different distros or not? Because you have Ubuntu, which is basically just saying Ubuntu is Unity, or we have Ubuntu Mate and Ubuntu KDE or Kubuntu. What's really the difference between Kubuntu and KDE Neon? Are those different enough to say that they're different distros? Well, in those cases, you're utilizing some different package sources. And I did a video where I compared those two. We have things like Tails. So Tails is basically a live key. I'd call that a full distro, because they've really done a lot of different things with the packages inside of Tails. And let's see. Xubuntu. I think Netrunner would qualify as a utility. I can't remember what Netrunner is. Debian base. No. My fault. I had never used that one. Parrot. You have things like Parrot and Kali, which are, you might call these distros, or you might, I don't know, we might coin another word for these things. Maybe like system-specific distros or something. Of course, Parrot and Kali are specifically designed for penetration testing and security. Remix OS and the Android ones are for doing your Android things. So I'm just kind of looking through the list here just to think about. PFSense is another one. I didn't see it on the list, but that's another one. PFSense would be a distro, and maybe even I run Open Media Vault. These aren't systems that we would use as a means to run a full computer, but they're very utilitarian. So Open Media Vault is what I use to manage all my media folders and my NAS drive. PFSense you'd use as a Linux distro again, but more maybe a Linux utility to produce a router out of a computer. OpenELEC versus Open Source Media Center would be Linux utilities that create a media center, because they're more narrow than what you'd have as a full desktop operating system. And maybe we're getting large enough in the Linux community that we might want to start talking about this in a little bit more full of a sense, so that somebody knows, what's really is the difference between MX16 and Peppermint. Well, they're both based on, I think one of those is based on Debian versus the other one is Ubuntu. So that's really the major difference. The major similarities are both XFCE. So they're going to have a lot of the same system utilities, much the same. And so what's the difference between Lubuntu and Bobuntu? Well, a couple of themes. And I think that's the same with a lot of the newer, smaller systems are coming out, which are more flavors based upon different theming and things like that. It's not like Ubuntu or Mint where they're or Arch or other things where they're looking at all the packages as they're made available in Linux and then making adjustments, adjusting the made sources, and then figuring everything out. No, these are just basically those core distros with a few extra themes, a few extra software packages installed by default, and maybe a few added PPAs. Are they good? Absolutely. They're great. But maybe I agree with my commenter there, Craig, in that maybe we need to stop calling things like that full-blown distros just for the purpose of not letting new users be so confused. Like, should I run Babuntu or Ubuntu? Well, they're essentially the same thing, except, like I said, different software installs. If you like watching English Bob's channel, which I'd highly recommend doing, he has some great stuff over there, and you really like his operating system, download Babuntu, because that's what he uses. If you're just looking, like in my case, I use Ubuntu for my banking because it's something that I can run very lightweight on a USB key, and I can encrypt it very easily. And so there's different reasons to run these different distros, but I'd just like to ask, should we be having a discussion about what's the difference between a distro, a alternately themed distro, a utility, maybe open up more discussions about desktop environments and where they fit in with distros. So with all that, I just kind of want to start to get a conversation going about Linux in general moving forward. As new users come onto the system, can we start clarifying a few of the words that we're using? And it's just an opinion piece. Let me know your thoughts, whether you agree or whether you disagree. I'd be interested in knowing everybody's thoughts. So with that, just a short video here, a quick commentary, and leave your comments below. I'd love to see opinions on either side of these, other suggestions, anything that we can do to clarify things for newer users coming on. So with that, this has been Tom, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.